Kubernetes for Humans.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Kubernetes for Humans podcast. My name is Itiel Schwartz, and today with me in the show we have Donnie. Donnie, can you please introduce yourself?
Hey, I'm Donnie Berkholz. I'm currently the founder and chief analyst of an independent analyst firm called Platify Insights. We focus on technology platforms in general, but specifically areas like cloud-native computing, generative AI, and platform engineering.
Okay, sounds super relevant. And I think it will be interesting to hear, like in the end, I always love to ask the interviewee about his prediction. So I can't wait to hear your prediction as you do it for a living. But let's start with like your background. Like, what did you do? How did you get into the tech space? How did you get into like the containers and Kubernetes space? And then let's take it from there.
Sounds good. Yeah, I have a non-traditional background, so I definitely did not go up and get my CS degree and kind of follow that natural path into software engineering or whatever else. I went into science, so I thought I was going to be a scientist doing biomedical research. I got my bachelor's degree in biochemistry, got my Ph.D. in biochemistry and biophysics. I was doing something called X-ray crystallography, which I don't think we'll have time to get into here. But
well, what went wrong? Like,
I think it's what went right, since we're here and things are going pretty well. But what went right was, as I was doing science, two things happened. One of them was I had to learn how to use Linux so that I could do some of these simulations of how the molecules might move, test the different kind of shapes they would take, test how like a drug might dock into a protein to make its effects happen inside your body. So I had to use Linux. I had to get pretty technical, get familiar with the command line, get familiar with working with Linux systems. And then that turned into a passion because I found out that I loved it. So I started using it, started joining communities. The community I joined first was FreeBSD. A little bit later, I joined Gentoo Linux. I started with Red Hat back pre-Red Hat Enterprise Linux. And so I joined this community called Gentoo. And I just found this passion and this thing that I loved, which was everything was in my control. And so it got to the point where I started contributing to it, became an open source developer, became one of the leaders of the project, spent I think like 13 years contributing to this Gentoo Linux distribution, which is still around today. They actually just announced the other day that they've now got binary packages again, so you don't have to compile it all from source yourself anymore. So it's not kind of comparable to Arch and those again. So I spent a long time on that, and then during the day, the science got more and more computational in nature. First, it was working with Linux. Next, it was writing code to manage all these different libraries and simulations. Eventually, I felt like I was almost a software engineer with the job title of a scientist. And that got so far along that I decided, I'm enjoying the means more than the ends. I'm having more fun doing the technology than I am doing the science. And I imagined myself, and I looked at some of my mentors in science, and they spent a lot of their time trying to get grants, trying to get funding to do the work. That's not fun. Doing the work is fun. Getting the money is not so fun. Whether you're in science trying to get grants, or maybe whether you're a CEO of a startup trying to go get your next round, that's not the fun part. The fun part is doing the thing, creating the impact. So long story short, fast forwarded from all that beginnings, spent some time as an industry analyst at companies like RedMonk and 451 Research, focused on software development, DevOps, and platforms. Spent some time as an end user. I was leading a DevOps transformation at a large travel tech company, Carlson Wagonlit Travel, which has an office in Tel Aviv, or did last time I was there. And,
what's the name again?
Carlson Wagonlit Travel, so it's CWT. Mm-hmm. They had an office. I'm trying to remember this. It's by a shopping mall toward the eastern side. Big towers there. Mm-hmm. I could look it up if I had a minute.
No,
but,
never mind.
Yeah, spent a little time there some years back, and then moved on from CWT when COVID hit and travel got real boring real fast, to spend some time as a VP of products at Docker, and then SVP of products at Percona, open source databases, which has Kubernetes operators, it turns out.
Oh.
So, and most recently, I decided to move off, branch out, and start my own company.
So why starting your own company? Share maybe a bit more about you getting into Kubernetes, first insights, first everything. So maybe let's focus a bit on the Kubernetes side. What was the company stage? What were your thoughts back then? And then let's maybe go into the future.
Yeah, I started tracking containers real early on, back at RedMonk and 451. So we're talking containers were, kind of 2012 to 2015. Things were really starting to heat up with Docker. And then maybe 2016, 2017 onwards, Kubernetes enters the scene, starts beginning to pick up steam as a potential alternative for running things at scale. And so I was tracking that as an industry analyst back then, paying really close attention, talking to people all the time about, why use containers? Like, what's the value of it? What's the impact it's creating for you? Like, it's cool technology. Everybody agrees that's really cool and it's fun and it's now usable in a way it wasn't just a few years ago. But what's the why? And what's the value? And how can we quantify that value if possible so that we as developers and engineers and operators can convince our executives that it's worth doing. It's worth setting aside the time. It's worth setting aside the budget to migrate something over to Kubernetes that's already running just fine. Like, what's the reason? And so we would come across all kinds of different reasons. And it was great for me then moving into more of the enterprise side at CWT to live that, to walk in the footsteps of the people I was talking to every day and just see things from a completely different perspective. Because there we had, I'll call it like an internal anarchy almost, right? Each product group was very free to do whatever it felt was necessary to achieve its business outcomes, right? There was no top-down mandate. Instead, it's much like we talk about now with empowered product teams, right? Same concept, but at large, right? Across product organizations, you might have one focused on travelers, for example, in this company, and one focused on travel managers, the people who like run a travel policy inside some big organization, and one focused on, another group of people who, like our travel counselors who get called up when the plane falls apart and you need to find a new plane, those kinds of things. And so each one of those had its own initiatives, had its own outcomes, adopted different technologies to get there, right? In some cases, they had things like Docker. In some cases, they were using something like Amazon ECS. They were running their own Kubernetes. And we had this whole spectrum of different technologies being adopted with different levels of interest and knowledge and willingness to really dive in deep, or people who really wanted to stay as far away from it as possible and just learn the bare minimum necessary and then move on with their lives of creating business value.
Okay, that makes total sense. So maybe share, you've been in like both like IC and then like went on to like a more like managerial roles, right? And product roles in your like past life. And I wonder, like, what do you think is like the biggest change that happened over like the last, let's say, like 5-6 years in this landscape, right? Like there were the cloud wars or like the orchestrator wars, right? Between like Docker, Mesos, and Kubernetes. It feels like, like Kubernetes is kind of like the last man standing, but I wonder, you've been there also like pretty much that time. Like, how did it feel like back then? And then maybe also like your take on like why did Kubernetes won overall in the end?
Yeah, I think if you rewind to, like you say, 6, maybe 7, 8 years ago, it was very unclear what was going to happen, right? We had Mesosphere, we had Kubernetes, we had Docker Swarm. Docker had kind of 2 different versions of Swarm, which got a little bit confusing for people over time.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, there's like the one that's built into the engine as a client, and then there's like the kind of enterprise operations edition. So people started to be like, what Swarm are we talking about here? At the time, it was very unclear what was going to happen. People were choosing all 3, and I think, this is really symbolic of something we see a lot in technology, which is that when there's lots of innovation happening in a space, there's lots of fragmentation that happens in that same space, right? Tons of different options out there. People are choosing all of them because they all seem the same, or they can't tell the differences apart. There is no effective differentiation, or some of them just aren't general purpose enough to appeal to enough different use cases out there so that people can see a clear right answer. And then at the end of that phase of innovation becomes consolidation, right? Things start to merge back together. It becomes clear what the obvious solution is. Like the obvious solution, maybe 10 years ago, there would be a clear answer to what CPU should you get? What brand, what company makes it? But if you ask that same question today and you said, what CPU should I get? What architecture should it be? That answer is not as clear today as it was, right? And it might even be driven by what brand of laptop manufacturer you prefer rather than making a CPU choice specifically, right? So we see this fragmentation and consolidation happening over and over. Living through that, it was, it was just a real messy time, right? And every time that's happening, every vendor under the sun tries to jump in and sell their own wares, somehow make their pitch appeal to whatever is happening at the time. And so what was going on at that time, right? You had container orchestration rising, but you also had DevOps as kind of the dominant term for the entire decade of the 2010s, I would say, right? Which means everybody was DevOps washing. We still have these DevOps Days conferences around. I'm a co-organizer for the Minneapolis one where I live.
Yeah.
And it's great to see them, but they're evolving, right? The roles continue to shift. The technologies continue to shift. If they want to stay in existence as a community and an event, they have to evolve with the times, right? You can't say, oh, I like DevOps the way it was in 2015. We really had it right then. Like, you're kind of like the server huggers from, back in the data center days where they're like, oh man, we gotta name all our servers and we gotta give them names like Star Trek characters or whatever it might be. We've mostly moved past that, thankfully, but there's still a lot of that resistance to adopting new technologies. And so, bring that back to like my experience at CWT, where we had multiple different container solutions. We had teams choosing the right tool for the job or the tool that, may have just been most familiar to them, right? In many cases, there isn't an obvious right tool, even after you go and do a ton of diligence. And so the right tool might be the tool with the lowest barrier to entry for your team. And that might be whatever that team is most familiar with, most comfortable with, right? Whether that's the tool itself or the framework within that tool operates. Like if you're an AWS shop, chances are it's going to be really easy for you comparably to pick up another AWS solution. Then it might be to try and completely roll your own inside your own environment, do it all from scratch, do the, we're going to just run fully open source Kubernetes. We're just going to download it from the website, stand it up and get it going, right? Like that's something that, we actually tried doing something a lot like that as well to say, hey, we'd love this vanilla Kubernetes, maximum portability, right? You could run it anywhere, no lock-in, that'd be amazing. And that is sort of true, but also the barrier is incredibly steep to get there. And it ends up not necessarily being worth the extra investment you make, because every time you do that, you're delaying time to business value so that you can minimize your lock-in costs for something that happens pretty rarely.
So, I think choosing the distribution or the way you architect both the infrastructure and the teams is one of the hardest decisions, right? And you feel it's an iterative process. But we see in common, a lot of our customers are doing the migration to Kubernetes, and no one is sure that he's doing it right? There are so many different variables. So I wonder, what do you, and it also goes to what you're apparently doing, right, as a research firm. But what would you suggest? Let's say you're a company that grew in the cloud, they are using AWS EC2 machines, Chef, Puppet, Ansible, right, all of that in order to spin up everything. And now they want to migrate to Kubernetes. What do you think is the go-to solution right now? And what are the different parameters that you would consider when doing this kind of migration? Is it around the, like you said, the agility, taking a clean EKS, afraid of vendor locking? What would you suggest to a company in that stage? Because we do see a lot of companies, putting one toe into the Kubernetes water and feeling, that they're really not sure what is the best thing to do.
Right. Yeah, I think question number one is always, is Kubernetes the right answer for this application? I think that's the most important one, because while it may scare some people away initially, right, you may lose potential customers. Those weren't the right customers in the first place, because they're going to adopt it and they're going to say, wow, we invested all this time and all this effort, and this thing just is not well suited to our workload, right? We have this very static workload, not a lot of variability in traffic over time, just an internal application. It doesn't need to be zero or minimal downtime because it's, maybe it's running the expense management system for a company or something, right? And it's fine if we just take it down every once in a while for an upgrade, right? So I think, question number one is always, is Kubernetes the answer we need? how
How
do you
can I know
operate
that?
that?
I think it's a good question, but how can I know? Like when is Kubernetes the right thing for me? And I know it's like a hard question, but let's try, to simplify it. What are the things that screams like use Kubernetes versus the things that are like, yeah, dude, like just I don't know. Like if I'm hosting a blog, probably right. Like I don't need Kubernetes. Okay. But let's say like I am a grown company. I already have like let's say like 100 of EC2 machines, different sizes. So I have some workload already. How do I know if I should now like go to ECS or something like that, or choose Kubernetes, or maybe something else? Like maybe you'll surprise me here, but like how can I know?
Yeah, I think there's going to be a lot of different factors to consider, right? Because you've got some I'll just kind of run through off the top of my head will be, you want to decide, do you need the advantages that you get from Kubernetes specifically? Maybe it's only Kubernetes, or maybe Kubernetes is a good example of how to get these benefits, right? Do you need minimal downtime for this application, even throughout things like configuration changes and upgrades, right? And do you want a solution that can make that fairly easy for you to do, so you don't have to roll a lot of the technologies to do that yourself, right? Kubernetes can make it pretty easy, relatively speaking, to do things like, drain traffic from one pod, switch it over to another pod. You get things like blue-green deployments out of that. You get things like rolling upgrades out of that. If those are benefits you're looking for, so that you can very easily change your software at low cost because you deploy very frequently, or because you make a lot of configuration changes, or because your customers are very intolerant of any downtime, even a couple of minutes to deploy an upgrade. Maybe that's a specific customer need, or maybe you've got millions of customers, so that some of them are going to run into that problem no matter when you're doing it, right? Those all make really good cases for using a solution like Kubernetes. Another good use case is not for Kubernetes specifically, but people need to stay with the times. Otherwise, you get left behind, right? There are still many, many companies out there that, with a lot of their software deployed on mainframes or deployed on like AIX, lots of old things that have been around since, the mid 1900s, the late 1900s. They run fine, but it becomes increasingly challenging to find people with the skill set and with the desire to work on those things, right? People want to work on things that can build their resume.
Always
them get their next promotion, that can help them get their next job, right?
No, I think like hiring is like a key factor sometimes. Like trying to find like an expert, also like mainframe now. I'm not sure like how many. I think some exist, right? But it's going to be much more rare in the future. And obviously, like most of the time, I don't want to say anything, but they are not the top like talent. The top talent usually do adopt to the new technology, like love learning, love trying new things, and so on. So I completely agree with you. And let's say that I'm not choosing Kubernetes. Like, is there anything else that you would recommend me on like choosing or looking at, or it's like mainly like Kubernetes or like, and that's pretty much it.
No, I mean, I think, if you're deciding not to use Kubernetes, one of the best reasons to choose not to do Kubernetes is because you can't maintain the in-house skill set required to run it effectively at scale. And so, a lot of times, this is like, if you back up maybe 10 years, the same kind of problem happened with Hadoop back then, and the big data kind of explosion is that companies wanted to get their own Hadoop running, and they would invest in training up their staff, and then their staff would instantly get hired by the company across the street at a much higher rate because Kubernetes or Hadoop experts were so in demand.
Yeah.
Kind of thing happens with Kubernetes or whatever technology is in vogue at any given time. It can be hard to maintain a team that's skilled enough inside. And so you may choose to say Kubernetes isn't the right answer for this reason, or you may choose to say, I need to find a way that I can get access to these experts who work for a different company, right? Using a managed services provider, using some sort of global SI, like whatever your answer is to get that fully managed Kubernetes option. Maybe you go through your cloud provider. There's a lot of different ways to go about it, but how do you get a place that can keep that expertise in-house so that they can help you keep your application up and running and creating value? So that's probably one of the best reasons is inability to maintain sufficient expertise. Another really good reason is if you can get most of the benefits you need without most of the complexity you need. And so, if you're running a monolithic application, right, you're not microservices, then Kubernetes will not bring a lot of the potential benefits it could bring because you're not able to distribute that application to minimize your blast radius, to minimize the customer impact of any changes that happen or anything that goes down over time, or any of the declarative infrastructure about how many how much you want to keep running at any given time. So if you don't have a need for that because one, you're a monolith, or two, you don't have high uptime requirements, or then that third possible answer of you have a hard time maintaining the skill set, those are all reasons to say maybe you need to stick with something simpler. That something simpler might be just a hosted container solution. I'll just say ECS as an example here. It might be running things yourself in your own EC2. It might be running things in your own data center, right? We do see a little bit of that, what's repatriation is the word, cloud repatriation. In my opinion and my experience, it's not a myth, but it is so outweighed by the amount of applications being moved to the cloud that you're talking, 90 applications move to the cloud, one application moves back. Like, yeah, you saw the one and somebody wrote a news story about the one because they want to make it a thing. Usually it's some kind of vendor with a vested interest.
Yeah.
Yep, data centers still matter. And they do for workloads that were never well suited to cloud in the first place. Some of those got discovered after they were already migrated there and then got moved back.
No, I think that makes a complete sense. So, we don't have a lot of time. Maybe let's talk about the future. So, your current role, maybe talk a bit about how did you get there? How do you start your own firm and why? And what are the things that you're seeing in the market?
I started my own firm for a few reasons. I've always had a desire to start a company. I've heard that it's super hard, but I've also heard that you learn a lot. And there's a lot of things that I've been wanting to learn about running a business, especially as I got more and more into the product side of things, that I felt like I would have an opportunity to learn a lot of those things, and hopefully, enjoy myself, be super stressed, don't get it wrong, but also enjoy myself a lot, doing something I'm really passionate about along the way. And I decided to take a different take to this, right? My goal wasn't to be a startup. It was to be a solopreneurship operation, which, some people may have heard of, some may not have, right? The goal is just a one-person company that the long-term goal is to be a one-person company, right? Not to hire people, not to grow, not to scale, just bootstrap it, don't get investors, get, a number of different clients. That's what makes it a company instead of being a single contractor that just works for, one other company at a time, but have a bunch of different clients who are coming to me for what I do best, which is strategy and analysis, right? So people who go to industry analysts are typically going to them for a few reasons, right? One of them is, I call it rent a brain, right? Go just find a smart person, get access to their brain on a part-time basis. You maybe don't want them full-time. You maybe don't want to pay for them full-time, whatever it might be. And another one is, their access and influence of the market, right? They know a lot of people. They have a big network. They're talking to people, learning things all the time, whether that's qualitatively or doing things like surveys to do quantitative research on where the market is. And then they're sharing that research back out there with the world to, one, help educate people on how do you do things better? How do you make better choices about your technology? But two, that has the byproduct of influencing the market as well. And so when an analyst makes a prediction, they are both making their best educated guess about where things will go, but they're also aiming to influence the direction of the market at the same time, right? If they say something like, we want whatever it is to become 37% of something by 2026, right? They're trying to push the market in that way, in a sense as well, right? They're saying you should really be looking into this. The same thing if you think about, like Gartner hype cycles, for example, right? They're pushing the market in certain directions by saying you should investigate this up and coming trend. You should really be looking into whatever it is right now, and generative AI is clearly overhyped right now, right? It's all anybody's talking about. But if you think about some of the, kind of byproducts of that, right? Like RAG, for example, everybody in that space is looking to these RAG-based applications to get access to corporate internal data for their chatbots or other LLM applications.
Okay.
So to go back to your question,
how things are going? How things are going for you? For the company, is it still only you? Is it bigger now?
No, it's still just me. So this has been super interesting, right? Because I do my own accounting work. I stand up my own website and maintain that. I do my own sales work. and I'm of course the product, which is being an analyst. And so that's all on me, which has been, like I said, super interesting. I've discovered some things that you have to do that I really don't enjoy doing at all, but you just have to do them to make it work.
You can give us an example, like what? Accounting?
Yeah, bookkeeping is a great one, right? Like I never liked filing expenses as an employee. Now I get to do both sides of that, right? I get to file them and I get to fulfill them and make sure things get reimbursed and things get moved across accounts and all that sort of way. Sales is another area where I can do a little bit of it, but I'm not a sales expert. I've never been trained in sales. I haven't spent years of experience in sales, right? If you want somebody who dedicates their time to really selling the stuff and you'd rather be creating the product, it's best to have a specialist in that sort of place because they're much higher success rate, much more consistent, spend less time on it, all those sorts of things. So yeah, it's been super interesting so far. I think the best way to describe businesses at this stage is, let's see, it is revenue positive, cash flow negative. And what that means is I've made money, but I'm not making enough yet. So it's a long process. Right? I'm only about 9 months into it right now. But it's good advice. Like for anybody thinking about starting their own business, like make sure you have enough cash in the bank to survive for a while, because it takes a while, right? If you were in a startup and you were trying to just get bootstrapped, you might take 2, 3, even more years to iterate and pivot your way toward product market fit. You need to have a way to eat in the meanwhile and to pay your rent or pay your mortgage, right? To live. And so, think about that for anybody starting a company. Have your backup plan and have your insurance or your safety net, whatever that might be in whatever country you're in, so that you have the ability to start that. That's, some people are able to do that very early in their careers, especially if they're able to raise very early funding that helps provide just enough money. But if you want to bootstrap, you might not be in that position early in your career. You might have to wait till later.
Okay, no, that makes sense. So maybe like last questions, what are your predictions? Like let's talk about Kubernetes, right? Because we're a Kubernetes shop. Yeah. What are your biggest trends that you're seeing, or like your boldest prediction?
Yeah, I think, the obvious trend, and everybody's going to be talking about this, is generative AI, right? And so the intersection of that with Kubernetes, though, is getting pretty interesting.
Yeah.
Right? Where they're seeing, coming from multiple different directions, right? There's people who are wanting to train their LLMs inside of Kubernetes. And so, what kinds of things does Kubernetes itself need to change to make those workloads run really well, right? Because they have different workload characteristics than just running your typical application. There's a lot of different factors of that you might have to adapt the ecosystem and core Kubernetes itself so that it can effectively handle those workloads, right? Things like, what's the overhead of direct access to GPUs right now? Is that good enough for LLM training workloads or not? What is the network requirements going back and forth between different nodes for this training to work effectively, right? Lots of different options in there. And Kubernetes, generative AI workloads have a lot of similarities to high performance computing workloads. And so it's interesting because all the things that benefit generative AI right now are actually got this side effect of benefiting high performance computing, which is going to be great for adoption of Kubernetes in like scientific communities, like academic research, as well as areas like defense that, people have different opinions about. So I think, the workloads itself for generative AI is super interesting space, right? There's of course going to be more and more happening there. No question about that. And we'll see Kubernetes itself adapting to it. I suspect we'll see specific distributions trying to go after that by adding some of those features, providing out-of-the-box configurations that work most effectively for LLM workloads, and pushing that on the marketing side as well as being the right choice if you're going after generative AI and Kubernetes. I've seen, I was at last KubeCon, and there are a lot of startups emerging that are focused on generative AI as well. In a few different places. Some of them, I would say, are very tangentially related to KubeCon or Kubernetes at all. They were there because they wanted to reach the audience of platform engineers. They weren't really there because they had anything to do with Kubernetes. But it's interesting to see them emerging, right? You've got generative AI applied to things like unit test generation, docs generation, turning product specs into code, right? All those sorts of pieces of the software development lifecycle that are related to transformations, right? I don't see it. A lot of the fun demos are about code generation from scratch, but that results in very unmaintainable code over time. The transformation aspect is much more interesting to me. How do you change the application code into tests if you have poorly tested code? Or how do you change it into initial documentation? Those transformations, or how do you migrate it to a new version of Spring that comes out with, effectively zero touch, right? Those are super interesting use cases to me. And so, a lot going on there. There's continued growth in platform engineering, right? That's the new term. I'm spending a lot of time there. But what we're seeing is the same kind of things we've seen with DevOps. Is it's starting to become very whitewashed by some vendors and losing some of its meaning. Right. So when I think about what does platform engineering mean? To me, it means three things, right? It means you're providing self-service to your developers. It means you're thinking about the platform as a product, right? And applying product management approaches to that platform internally. And it means you're applying product operations, which means things like SRE and DevOps style approaches to running the platform itself at scale, more of the cattle versus kind of pets model that we used to talk about. Mm-hmm. So if you've got those three things, to me, that is platform engineering. But you've got vendors who are all jumping in and trying to make their stuff somehow fit into it. Some of them don't satisfy all those needs because part of those needs are people, right? It's people and process. It's not technology. But every vendor is got to say, oh, we could give you platform engineering. Well, you can't. You can get us part of it. You can get us the technology, the capability, but it's also on the people to make that transition toward that platform as product model and toward operating that platform using modern approaches to platform operations rather than operating it like we're still in the old manual mode with, filing tickets and doing individual configurations by hand instead of using, GitOps or anything newer. Right? There's a lot of ways to not do platform engineering, even with a tool that is capable of it. And there are also a lot of ways to do platform engineering without adopting the latest technology. All right. The example, I'll be talking at FOSDEM in just a few days here about platform engineering, the biggest open source conference in Europe. And, I'll be talking about how much of it you can do with Jenkins, right? Mm-hmm. You don't always need the latest, greatest modern solutions. There's a whole lot you can do with anything that can run a job. There's limitations, and those limitations will start to catch you at a certain point. But if you let that stop you from getting started, you're putting a really big barrier in front of yourself, right? The most important thing is to get started, start seeing the benefits of that. Then you can adopt it. Then you can modernize it. Then you can get even more benefits through more investment. But if you can't show those initial early wins, it's very hard to justify the big investment of time and effort later.
Okay. Last thing before we wrap up, anything you want to say to the world?
Anything I want to say to the world? Well, thanks for listening through the last 30 minutes here, because I really appreciate it. And if you do have any questions for me, feel free to reach out. My website is platifyinsights.com.
We will put it over the notes. Thanks a lot, Donnie, for being a great guest, and good luck.
Thanks. Appreciate it. Have a great rest of your day.